beleza. So good afternoon, everyone. So this is the second lecture series in Transversal Talks. We're gonna have here Arthur and Yeraldi. So I'm gonna read Arthur mini bio. So Arthur Menezes is a biologist by training. He got his bachelor degree from Emory University in the US, where he worked with experimental evolution of hosts and parasites, analyzing the interplay between host heterogeneity and virulence evolution. Currently, he's a PhD student in ecology and evolution at Princeton University, also in the US, and he's working with Professor Andrea Graham. He's also one of the EEB scholars, coordinators, ecology and evolutionary biology, a program that, we recommend you to apply for. And the EBB scholars intend to demystify the application process, helping scholars to navigate the process of applying to graduate school. And Yeraldi Loera is an ecology and evolutionary biology PhD student in Campbell Staton Lab at Princeton University. She has a master's in biology from the California State Polytechnic University in Pomona and a bachelor's degree at Occidental College in LA, US. In her research, she is interested in examining contemporary evolution due to exposure to anthropogenic contaminants, aiming to identify genomic signatures of selection that describe responses at multiple levels across the biological hierarchy. She is one of the EEB Mentors coordinators, and EEB Mentors is a longer virtual program where interested students get paired with a current Princeton EEB graduate student for mentoring. So we would like to extend our thank you for having you here and to have you here with us virtually. So please, everyone, help me welcome them.
Thank you, Natalia, for that wonderful introduction. Yeah, Yeraldi and I are so super excited to be here and running this workshop again. So how this is going to work is we've broken up the workshop into 3 sections, the 3 different parts over here. We're going to go through each of the numbered sections within each of the parts. And then at the end of each section, we'll stop and take any questions that you have. So no need to save all your questions for the end. Something that we just wanted to start off by saying is a lot of the things that we're going to talk about here are super specific to ecology and evolutionary biology programs, specifically the Princeton PhD program. But something to keep in mind is that programs are very different from each other, especially if you're interested in doing an epidemiology program at a school of public health, or you're more interested in molecular biology. So take everything we are telling you here with a grain of salt, especially if you're interested in applying to these other schools, the other departments. But a lot of the stuff that we're talking about in terms of interviewing and CVs and resumes, those will typically be applicable across a broader range of programs as well. Cool, so we will kick off. So part 1 is on things to consider before applying and when choosing where to apply and who to work with for graduate school.
Okay, thank you, Arthur. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having us. And I'll start off with just posting this question of a master's or a PhD for graduate studies. I've actually done both, so I can answer questions on both, but really you have to ask yourself at the end of your undergraduate career what you see yourself doing. Does it necessarily need a master's or a PhD to get into one of those programs? What type of training do you need? For instance, I finished my undergraduate in 3 years, so I wanted more courses and just more experience and time to figure out what it was I wanted to study. And that's why I did a master's first. And I'm so glad I did that. It just flies by, but I just learned so much from doing that. And then I applied for a PhD. However, when I started my PhD, I did notice that a lot of students came straight from undergrad, and they are completely capable of doing that as well. It's mostly a personal choice, and I feel like graduate school is it's a process, an individual process, no matter what. So really ask yourself, what is it that you expect to learn from these graduate studies? Do you want to end up in a certain type of career? Does that need a master's or a PhD? And that's where you can really decide where to start at. Really, the best way to go about finding these programs and what type of programs you want to apply to is to speak to mentors or professors in the field that you're interested in. So there are multiple types of masters and a PhD as well. For masters, you can take a course-based masters where it's a lot of courses and you don't need to do a thesis. Or there's also thesis-based masters, which is what I did, where you take courses and you do a thesis. It really does depend on the location of these masters and whether of these programs and whether or not they're just the way they're structured. But I do want you all to know that masters and PhD, the tuition and cost to get these degrees are usually paid for. So you should not be paying out of pocket for any research-based degrees. However, for a master's and a PhD, most of the time you do get a stipend either from the institution or from government grants. So masters, sometimes you get a stipend depending on the funding of that university and the grants you apply to. But PhDs usually have a stipend, which is essentially a paycheck you get to live off your studies as a PhD student. Okay, do you want to go on to thinking about which labs to apply to?
Yeah, I was going to add one more thing and then take any questions if anyone wanted to say anything. So typically, sometimes I think I felt this when I was applying because I was coming straight from undergrad, as I didn't feel prepared. I didn't feel like I was going to be a competitive applicant, and I felt like a lot of people would get in over me. So something you could potentially do is, if there is a lab that you're interested in working with or a specific professor, you can reach out to them and send them your CV, have a meeting with them, and ask them if they think that you have a good chance of applying and getting in this year, or if they recommend that you get more research experience, either by doing a master, or another alternative is a research assistantship or a lab technician position, which you can do for a shorter time period and doesn't take the full commitment of actually doing a master's course. So with that, we can take any questions on master's versus PhD before moving on.
Does anybody have questions? Okay, no, I think they don't.
Okay, perfect. So now, if you've decided that you do in fact want to pursue a PhD, the next step in the process is identifying specific programs, specific schools, and labs that you are interested in working with. So in the handout, we have listed a bunch of different scenarios because you could fall anywhere along the spectrum of not knowing what you want to do research in and also fully knowing exactly the study system and questions that you want to ask. Some of the tips that we write out here list that we recommend that you hone your interests, and you can do that by spending more time reading papers that interest you and looking at the people who are cited in those papers and the people who are on the authors list for those papers, specifically focusing on the senior authors who are typically last on the author list, and looking at other research that is going on within their lab and other papers that they have published. Another option is for you to also talk to undergrad professors, other people within your department if you're doing your master's, and just talk to them about your interests, because a lot of these fields are super connected and they might be able to recommend someone that they collaborate with or someone that they know that they recommend that you just check out their lab website and a few of their papers to see if you're excited about anything that they are doing. Something else that we also recommend is to not have super specific focus interests, because sometimes that might not work out in your favor. For example, if you knew exactly what type of research you wanted to do and with who you wanted to do it with, that is great that you have super clear ideas, but some professors might be skeptical that you are super focused on one specific system and one specific question, because one thing that you'll learn within a PhD is that things don't always work out the first time, and you need to be able to adapt and change to new things as things are thrown in your to your way. So yeah, so these are just a few tips on how to go about identifying labs and programs. We'll talk a little bit later about the next step, which is contacting these advisors, but we can stop here and take more questions. I know we haven't really covered that much more content, but if you had any questions on picking your lab, maybe Yeraldi, you could tell us what you looked for when you were going through the process of picking a lab that you were interested in.
Absolutely. So straight out of my undergrad, again, I wanted to take classes. So I looked for a place that offered a wide range of biology classes, but I also wanted to hone in on a tool set. So I really wanted to learn genomics and be introduced to genomics. And so that's what I looked for. Another thing to consider is how well established a lab is. So my master's professor, I was actually his first student. And so I actually thought that was a really good opportunity for me to get that one-on-one experience with him, to get a lot of mentorship, and also to learn how to set up a lab, to figure out, is this something I want to do in the long run? Meaning stay in academia, set up a lab and do research and teach. And so that's something that I really valued, that experience. And I'm really glad I took that into consideration. Really, my main point was trying to get more courses and to start on that genomic toolkit. So think about if there's an area that's lacking in your studies, or if you're just want to kind of try out a new field.
Yeah, that was great. So for me, I was interested in infectious diseases, but didn't have a specific disease system that I was interested in studying. So I was looking for a lab that was doing disease ecology, that was doing public health work, but that we're doing it in a bunch of different contexts, so that when I joined the lab, I could have some time to figure out exactly what system and where I wanted to work to answer these questions. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask before we moved on to contacting prospective advisors?
Okay, I don't think I see any questions. Contacting advisors. This is something I was not sure of how to do. I had no training on this and I didn't know what others were doing. So what I did for both my master's and my PhD was just to contact professors early. I almost recruited them, kind of like a fantasy football thing. Just make a list of the potential advisors you would like to work with, write down all the papers that are really interesting to you, make sure to read them, also look at their lab page. Sometimes lab pages can be a little older, so it's also good to keep an eye out on their Twitter. So a lot of people find it easier to tweet out, oh, I'm looking for a new graduate student, or I'm not taking any graduate students, and that can really help you understand where that lab is. So the best thing to do is to contact advisors, I would say late summer, like sometime August to October, the latest, just so you can get inside of their field of thought, so they can know your name, so they can know that you're interested in their lab, and they can start considering funding. So after you read their papers, you set up an email where you really describe who you are and you mention how you're going to be a good fit. So for instance, I mentioned for my PhD, I mentioned that I have been introduced to genomics, but I really want more of a genomics toolkit. I had this understanding in other fields such as ecotoxicology, like how pesticides and different contaminants are affecting organisms on the evolution level, but I really wanted a PhD where I can study that in the genome. And so kind of figuring out that little niche of where you fit and why their lab is really suitable for you is going to make them want to get you for their lab. So you don't have to do exactly what they do. You don't have to work in the same system, or you can be in the same system but ask different questions, as long as you have something in common and you show a really big interest, and that you're capable of filling in the gaps where they have those gaps. So my professor doesn't know much about contaminants, but I have that background and I can fill that gap myself. So kind of, yeah, just surrounding yourself with a perfect position, and backing it up with your CV. Your CV should be a couple of pages at most, but really you can focus in on those things that can make you look good as a suitable student. A few email do's and don'ts. I kept it around 2 short-ish paragraphs. Do not write an essay because professors are so busy. A lot of the times emails, if they're really long, maybe they'll wait to read it at a certain time of day, and then it'll be unread and get lost somewhere. So try to be succinct and concise about what you're trying to get across. And also, if they don't respond right away, I would say wait a week and a half to 2 weeks and then write another email. Just, hey, I just wanted to make sure you got my first email. I'm really interested in your research, and just be persistent, because again, professors are very busy and you can get lost in their email box very easily. But in that email, keep it short, explain how you would be a good match, and really sell yourself. They don't expect you to be perfect. They don't expect you to know everything and to essentially be them. It's okay for you to say you're lacking in certain areas, and that's what you want out of a PhD. Having that foresight to know what you want, getting out of it is really important for them. Sometimes if you get a response, they will want to meet with you, and that's great. A lot of the times it's going to be for a video call, and that's a really important time where you can ask for feedback on your application and what that lab is also looking for. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But going down, the first thing you should do after having an initial consultation with the advisor is to meet with their students as well. So I would say after meeting with them, you talk to their students, you ask the professor if you can get their students' information, just so you can know what type of student they're looking for, what type of methods they used, and they can also help you with the application process. So thinking about potential questions to ask a prospective advisor, they can help you try to figure out your mentorship style, your ideal mentorship style, and what they are kind of used to, or if they're willing to have a different mentorship style for you. What does the funding look like? What do grad students end up doing after leaving? Things like that. So a lot of information is going to come from that initial conversation with the PI, and then getting in contact with their graduate students. Does anybody have any questions on this section?
We have a few students with questions. They're just passing microphone.
Okay, great.
Hi.
Yes, hi.
Well, so I was thinking about this part of like contacting students from the lab. And last time I had this advice given to me was a week ago, in which we were talking to a professor, and I asked about stipends. And she said that it was very important to speak to the students of the lab to check how stipends were enough to be able to live with or not. But it wasn't an American professor. Would you say that in the UK and in Princeton, which is where you study, right, How is the general situations regarding stipends?
Awesome, great question. So Princeton and US schools in general, there is a stipend for PhD programs. It does depend on the university, and I think this is everywhere you go. It depends on the university. So I actually started my PhD at UCLA, which is in Los Angeles, California, and then my PI, my professor, moved to Princeton. And so I had to reapply, and I'm at Princeton now. And so those two stipends were different, and I understood how to live off of them from talking to graduate students. So before I entered UCLA, I knew that the stipends, I can be frank, it was around $30,000 to $32,000 a year, but the cost of living was pretty high. So with bills and everything, I know it's possible. It's just, it's a little more difficult with that stipend compared to other places like at Princeton, where the stipend is a lot more generous and the cost of living is relatively high, but there's just a lot more wiggle room there. So talking to graduate students to understand what housing looks like. So a lot of the times graduate programs will provide housing options. So like graduate student housing where you pay just like an apartment, or you live off campus somewhere that's not affiliated with the university. And that just really can vary depending on the city you're in. And so I talked to graduate students about where they lived in graduate housing or outside of graduate housing to really understand what life is kind of going to look like. It's definitely absolutely possible. I was able to live on campus at UCLA and off campus at Princeton. And so it really depends on the location. I think universities can definitely do better in some cases, but in most cases, you should be able to live off the stipend. And if not, if there are certain circumstances, like let's say you have dependents or other responsibilities, I do believe that you can contact either the department or the graduate school and they can figure something out. Arthur, do you have any other tips?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And it, like the professor you were talking to said, like you really need to be asking that to the graduate students because they're going to give you the best answer. And it's not just stipend, it's the cost of living, because stipends vary so much from university to university, but the cost of living also varies too. So something that's a less stipend at one university might be manageable because the cost of living around there is a lot less. So just one point of clarification that we talk about later in the workshop is that there's funding to support you as a graduate student, and then which is your stipend. So that's money that goes straight to you. You don't use any of that money for research. That money you use to pay your rent, to buy groceries, for whatever you want. The university has no control over that money. They essentially give that money to you every month and you use that however you like. And then there is funding for research projects, and that can come through your PI, that can come through grants, but that's something that's completely separate from the stipend that you use to live during your PhD program. I think there was another question too.
Yes, there's another student. She's gonna ask you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. My name is Paula. I was curious about the email part, about sending an email to a potential advisor, and about this part saying, do not send a generic, unpersonalized email. And I'd like to ask, what classifies as a generic, unpersonalized email?
I would say anything that doesn't describe how you fit into their lab in particular. So Arthur is going to show a couple of templates and examples. These are links at the end of the worksheet where you can kind of see what a good email response kind of looks like. But I mean, the beginning is all going to be the same, where you say, hello, I am this person. I studied this. I'm looking for a graduate program in this. That part will look the same across professors, but really it's that second paragraph where you really kind of sell yourself in their lab. Yes, what Arthur is highlighting.
Yeah. So if a professor is reading an email, they don't want to say, they don't want to be able to tell that like you just copied and pasted the same email to a bunch of different people. You've like personalized the email to that person by talking about a research question that they have or a project that they have that you are particularly interested in. And then you also mentioned briefly in how you would want to take that further or what types of questions that you have and why you think you would be a good fit in their lab. Did that help answer your question?
Yes, it does answer. Thank you.
Any other questions?
This is not something that's on the worksheet and sometimes isn't talked about, but at the end of an email, sometimes you can add like a signature. It would be really good if you had like a research website or, I mean, this isn't super common, but if you had the time, you can make a free research website, and that kind of gives a professor more an in-depth understanding of your interests, your favorite papers, your previous research. It's kind of like a more interesting CV. So in that email, you do attach your CV, but I mean, looking at photos, looking at the way you organize your questions can sometimes tell a lot to a PI. This is totally not necessary, but I think it's something that can kind of give you a leg up when first contacting a PI.
Yeraldi, I think there's another question here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just about the website. Yeah. It's just I wanted to you to get into some more detail about it. Like what kind of things that we could put on this website.
Okay.
If we should put I don't know, coding projects or yeah.
Arthur, do you want to look up my website really quickly?
Yes, I can. What is it?
Just
Is it
put
just
Yeraldi Loera, yeah, at WordPress, I believe. It's not totally updated. I last updated it maybe 6 months ago. Yes, that one. And this was totally free to make. Sometimes, like I used WordPress, which is a website where you can make a free website. Sometimes they ask you to pay for your URL, but you don't have to do that. You can do a free one. Yeah, so this is just an introduction to myself, my different degrees. It's kind of just like a mini research website, something similar to what your PI will have. I work with alligators, so I show really cute alligator photos. Yeah, and then there's different tabs up on top, so about different research projects. This is probably more advanced because I'm already in my PhD, but even if you just had a homepage, like that first About Me page, can show that you're starting to think about yourself, like kind of like selling yourself as a researcher. And I actually, if you go to my website and you go to the tab SciComm, I have a couple of videos introducing, like, I think there's one about how to make a website. There's a video about my research, a video about using Zotero, and you can find a lot of these on YouTube. I learned how to make this website just from YouTube. So please feel free to email me if you have any questions about website making.
Another question based on this is that I see that there's it's kind of like a little blog or in the tab that you are right now, right? Do you think that making this kind of tutorials in our own websites and blog entries kind of could be a good selling point for us?
I mean, of course, it kind of just shows your interest. I have a lot of interest in mentorship, so I I have blogs and videos of me doing that because it's really important to me. If you have like a video or a blog about coding and you're sharing that with the world, I mean, it's showing that you are a really good collaborator, that you're trying to kind of like disseminate science. And yeah, I think it can be a positive thing. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay.
But
Any other
also just
questions?
like to stress, I fully did not have a website. I don't have a website. I applied to grad school with no website. So by no means do not feel worried or stressed about making a website. You really just need a CV and a good email, and that can get you through as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Any more questions before we move on?
I think there are no questions.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so as we mentioned, like the process of applying to a PhD, you kind of start, we call it like you cast a wide net at the beginning. You might have a list of a bunch of people that you want to reach out and contact with, which is why it might be good to start in August, like Yeraldi said, because some professors might take longer to reach out to you. And as you're going through the process of chatting with them and you're asking these questions, you might realize like, oh crap, like maybe this lab isn't the best for me, like maybe this program isn't the best for me. And then you actually end up saving a lot of money because you don't have to then apply to that school and go through the application process, and you can better narrow down the schools that you're applying to places that you are more interested in, that the stipend is better, that the research is a better fit for you. So there is no magical number of programs that you should apply to. It's specifically dependent on you, dependent on how much time you have to devote to graduate school applications, because it does take a lot of time to prepare all of these different personal statements. Typically, we recommend 4 to 8, but less is totally okay, especially if you're just trying to test out the waters and you're okay with not going to graduate school this season, and you could go next season if you don't get an offer this time around. But definitely reevaluate all the labs that you've been considered and take into account the types of responses and contact that you've had with the professors and with the graduate students in those labs as well, to help narrow down to schools that you're more interested in going to. We also talk a little bit about maybe having some different level schools on your list. Some schools considered safer schools, schools that you think might be easier to get into, whether it's because they have a lot of funding or whether because the professor has said that you're likely to get in. And some more stretched schools, some schools that you think might be harder to get into, whether it's more competitive because of funding or the professor has a bunch of students that they're trying that are applying for their lab as well. Big takeaway here is don't overwork yourself. The applications do take a good amount of time, especially since some of you are working or doing your master's. It can cut into a lot of your free time as well. There are a lot of options for fee waivers available if the cost to apply to these schools is something that would cause financial burden to you. Definitely reach out to the professor that you're interested in applying to at that school or the admin of the graduate school program, and just explain your circumstance, mention to them that you're very interested in applying, but unfortunately the cost is a little too steep, and ask if there are any fee waiver opportunities. Most likely they will let you know that like there is a fee waiver and they will subsidize probably all of the cost associated with applying to this school. Any questions before we move on to part 2 of the workshop?
I do want to say that when I applied for a PhD, I had contacted around 12 PIs, and these PIs are at different levels and stages of their career. So, and also some are doing field work. Sometimes your emails just get lost. And so I heard back from maybe 6 of them. And then 2 of them I believed weren't a good fit. So I applied to 4 graduate programs, and I only applied once. I spoke with the professor and they said, yes, you would be a good fit. You should apply to the school.
Arthur and Yeraldi, there's a student at home and she raised her hand. I think, Gabi, you can open your mic and just ask your question.
Okay, do you guys listen to me? Okay,
Yes.
let me put that down. And just so I understand, if I understand it correctly, you guys said we should get in contact with professors by late summer. When do the programs usually start? It's usually in the beginning of the year then, because I got a little bit confused about the school year, because it's kind of different, right?
Yeah, so you usually apply, the end of summer, so like August, September, October, because you apply for graduate school in December. A lot of the times the applications are due in December, and then the school year will start that following September, August. So it's kind of a long process.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
what I wanted to understand. Thank you.
Yeah, and so when you apply in December, you usually hear back by like February if you get another interview. Sometimes they make you do an in-person interview, formal interview for the candidates, and then they'll let you know March, and then you have until April something. I forgot the date to decide.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Any other questions? Okay, so we can go on to part 2, which is things to consider when writing your personal statement, putting together your application materials, and interviewing. So your personal statement, this is really where it's kind of your time to shine. You talk about where you've been, where you are now, and where you hope to be in the future, and how a PhD program can get you there. And that's really important, that last part, stating how a certain PI, how learning certain techniques, how a certain school or facility can really help you get to where you want to be in the future. Let's see. So a lot of the introduction of these statements, again, is going to be you introducing yourself, and is going to look the same for the different programs, but for each individual program, you really want to mention the school, the PI, and a little bit about how you fit into that school and PI, and how that school fits into your plans, your lifelong plans. So you will tailor some of that per lab. Let's see, in terms of describing your potential research, you don't need to have a complete proposal in mind. You could talk about specific questions or tools you want to use, and that would be fine as long as the PI or lab you're interested in does those things. And really, this is where you describe your enthusiasm. I think this is writing tells a lot about you, and you can really sell yourself by just describing how excited you are about certain questions or systems or tools. So make sure you make that clear, and also make it clear how you're going to fit into the lab. Yeah. Another thing to add maybe is to consider certain grants you would consider applying to while you're in the program. So you can say, oh, if I join this program, I would consider applying for these grants to help with my research, or to help with this other thing I'm really interested in, like mentorship or fellowships. Arthur, was there anything else?
I think probably just the last thing, to make it super clear that you've spoken with the PI that you're going to work with at that school. This might seem kind of strange, but typically, like at Princeton, we have around 20 professors in the program, but then there are only like 2 professors who do the initial screen and read through the applications. So as they're reading someone's personal statement, it looks a lot better if you say that, like, I have contacted Professor XYZ and I've talked to them about potentially joining their lab, and I think it would be a good fit for these reasons, and I would be asking these questions in there, and it further expresses that you'd be a good fit for the department and that you've clearly spoken with someone there. Granted, some programs you do not need to speak with anybody because they're more rotation based, but most of the programs that I applied to that were EEB were the former, where you had to reach out to someone and then make it known who that individual was. And it is totally fine to list multiple people within your personal statement as well. And that's sometimes a really good thing because it shows the committee that you are open to working with various professors in the department in case something were to go wrong with your primary research advisor during the course of your PhD. Before we take questions, I just wanted to show, so at the end, we have a link to the Científico Latino Writing Center. And here you will find a bunch of information on a bunch of example personal statements and CVs that past graduate students have uploaded from various institutions and various programs. So this will be super helpful, especially if you're not in an EEB background or you're going to something more molecular based, to see how those CVs and statements are typically structured within that field that you are applying to. And a bunch of other sample research program statements and fellowship applications as well, especially if you're applying for one of the grants. So tons of good resources available at the end of this document. So we'd recommend taking some time to look through them. Any questions?
There's one question.
One thing that called my attention, it was already said that it's not a problem if you shift fields or shift the interests of research during your career, but how do the people reading your application interpret if you are someone who specializes in a single area through your whole career, or someone who shifted areas many times before applying?
Yeah, that's a great question.
And, go ahead.
That was actually where I fell into during the application process, because I was doing my undergrad working with C. elegans, Serratia marcescens, doing experimental evolution wet lab stuff, but I wanted to switch into immunology, epidemiology, more at the population level, focusing more on humans and moving away from model organisms. And I think the personal statement is really the place where you're going to convey what you've done in the past and why you are making the switch, what's been motivating you to switch fields, to switch interests. And that is also something you're going to talk to with your PI when you're initially having those conversations and saying that, like, I know clearly I might not have the tools and techniques that I would need to pursue this new field, but I am open to learning them. I'm very excited to learn them. And then just, you can ask them, like, do you think I would still have I'm still competitive enough to be able to get into the program? Or do you recommend that I take a year to do a research tech program or position somewhere to get those new skills? Typically with grad programs, they're super long, they're 5, 6, 7 years. And a lot of that time is learning new techniques and taking new classes and learning new skills. That's the whole, one of the big points of the PhD, is that they're not going to expect you to come and hit the ground running your first year doing research. And they don't expect that from you. And if you have a professor that's expecting that from you, that kind of is a red flag and might not be a good lab to go into, especially if they're not supportive of you taking time to learn new skills that you're interested in.
Absolutely. The best thing you can bring is your enthusiasm, and even your interest in switching fields and saying how they connect or why you decided to switch fields, I think can always be a plus.
Thank you very much.
So the next section, choosing your references or referees. A lot of the times these are PIs, like previous mentors in research, or even any type of academic mentor or professor you've had. It's best to stick with those types of referees rather than TAs or other grad students, just because they're kind of weighed more heavily than TAs and other grad students and postdocs, because they understand what it's like to have other graduate students. So other students just in general. So anybody who has students and can really single out your work ethic, skills, your interests, that is a good reference. So it's really important to meet with them, to let them know what you're interested in. Give them, I would say, no less than a month notice for your reference letters of reference as soon as possible is always best. And really meet with them, let them know what you're interested in, how your interests align with this lab, specific labs, and to emphasize, and just to be honest and emphasize whatever strengths they think you have. Any questions on letters of recommendation? Yes.
Yes, there's a question here. They're just passing mic.
Sorry, it's not a question about letters of recommendations. It's more a question about what we were discussing before, cover letters and I don't know, personal statements. Yeah. So about that, here in this classroom we have people from different backgrounds. So it's a quantitative ecology course. So there's people like me who are mathematicians. So we have this maybe different culture about writing this kind of thing. So one thing that I kind of notice is that for us, for mathematicians, it's much more common for us to be as dry and straightforward as possible when writing, at least from my experience, when writing this kind of personal statements. And you guys mentioned Científico Latino, where there's examples of personal statements, and I opened some of them, and they don't seem to be like that. So do you have any tips about how to write, how to think about writing maybe your personal statements for ecology?
In my opinion, I always think it's best to show your personality and whatever that may be. So if you like to be more serious of a writer, I think that's totally okay. But as long as you show your enthusiasm and yeah, I mean, just keep in mind that the readers are people, that they are reading many, many personal statements. And so you kind of just want to stand out in whatever way possible. Other than that, I think it could be field specific and also person specific. So read as many examples as you can, and also really just think about your story and how you want to present yourself, I guess.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, it really comes down to, I think, the opening paragraph of your personal statement and probably the closing paragraph, because everything else that's going in between is your research interest and things that you're going to show your personality through. But your first paragraph talking about maybe why you're interested in this field, why you're interested in science, like how the things that you've gone through in your life have shaped where you are today. I think that's where you have a freedom to maybe showcase more of your personality, more of your interests, and also non-academic interests as well can be mentioned briefly. You don't want to spend too much time talking about it, but you want to give the committee the perception that like you are this well-rounded student. You're not just focused on research and science, you have other hobbies and interests as well.
Thank you.
Cool. So if there are no more questions, we'll move on. There's another question. No. Okay. So one of the other, was that a question there?
Questions?
No.
Sorry.
Okay. So another thing that we have linked up as well is a quick start guide that has some suggested timelines of when to start contacting professors. And one of the things that they recommend doing earlier on in the process is looking up the exams that you might have to take to apply to some of these schools. So one of the most common ones is the GRE. A lot of programs have been getting rid of it. So it's probably likely that a lot of the schools, especially ecology and evolutionary biology programs, that you won't have to take this exam. So definitely try to maybe narrow down your list of schools that you're interested in applying to and look at their requirements, because it can take some time to study for this exam and you do have to pay to take it. So if you don't have to take it because none of the schools you're applying to are going to request it, then that's probably best for you. This is another very helpful link at the bottom, and it just goes through applying to graduate programs as an international student, because there might be some different types of exams that you might have to take if your undergrad institution wasn't an English speaking institution. So you might have to take some English proficiency tests. That is all depending on your department. So you just need to take into account that you need to take these tests, you need to study for them with sufficient time for the scores to be back in time by the application deadline for when you're applying to these programs. So it does take some planning in advance to make sure that all of those components are ready to go by the time that applications are due for the program. Any questions on exams?
No questions for now.
No questions. Okay.
I think there's a question in the back.
Sorry, they're passing mic.
Hello, I'm Laimara. The question is not actually about tests, but about other documents that we might have to submit, like, I don't know, a nossa. Diploma. Like,
Fala em português, traduz. Undergraduate certificate.
Or certificate.
Yeah.
undergraduate certificate or a master's certificate. I don't know if that's required anywhere, but like these types of documents and the translation of these documents, is it necessary for it to be translated like by an official institution or not? That's it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So you don't have to upload any certificates when you're applying and going through the application portal. It'll ask you just the name of the university that you went to, the year that you graduated, and that is sufficient. They will ask you, however, to submit official transcripts. So that'll have like your graduation date on there. That'll have all your grades for the courses that you took in that program as well. I'm not quite sure about the translation aspect of it. Typically, I know with US institutions that you can go to the registrar's office and ask them to directly send your transcripts to another institution. The transcripts are getting reviewed at the level above the program, so at the administration level within the graduate program. So they're looking at transcripts from a bunch of other international students as well. So I'm pretty certain that these individuals have a lot of training working with various different types of formats of transcripts. So they should be able to figure stuff out. But if you can get it translated, that would probably be for the best.
She's thanking.
Okay, so for interviewing, a lot of this we've said already. It's really exciting to get that notification for you to interview in person. A lot of the times the graduate school is going to they're going to pay to fly you out and for you to stay wherever near the campus so you can interview. Sometimes you do have to pay ahead of time and then they will reimburse you, but as long as you talk to the graduate coordinator, I'm sure there's something that can be set up if that's an issue. During interview week, we just had ours a couple weeks ago for the prospective students, and it's very exciting for the whole department. The department has a lot of activities, a lot of meetings and workshops for you to get an understanding of what the department is like, a lot of food in our case. And also there can be extracurricular activities outside of the workday. So a lot of the times graduate students can take you out for a drink. However, I really should emphasize that you should consider the way you're presenting yourself. Don't overdrink, don't overindulge in anything. Watch your manners, just a regular thing to understand, to keep in mind. And also, it's totally fine not to drink. I don't drink, and so that was never an issue for me. Graduate students or professors didn't think anything of it, and so don't feel pressured in any way. Just relax, be yourself, and the best thing is to really have questions in mind to help things go smoothly, because sometimes interviewing can be awkward. Sometimes you're going to have to interview professors who are not in your field or don't do anything related to your interests. So it's best to have an idea of questions you want to ask about the department. Know what the culture is like, know what the graduate students usually say about the department and what they end up doing after the graduation, things like that. So preparing for those types of questions outside of the questions you have for your advisor and their graduate students is really important. And also, you should definitely not try to compare yourself to other interviewees. So everybody has different backgrounds and different interests. And so it's important to show that you're collaborative, that you like to think about different things, but you're also not territorial in any way or a show off. So try not to speak over people. Try not to be overly selfish with that time. But the interviews are for the program to sell themselves too. So remember to ask questions to all type of faculty. This includes like the graduate coordinators, just to understand what the department's like, ways in which it can be better, and just think about yourself and how you would fit into that department. So yeah, talk to your grad students. It's also really nice to talk to grad students about life outside of research. I mean, we all have some sort of life outside of research, and it's really important to know what's around the area. So what they do, where they go, and how they find their living situation, and also overall mental health is really important to ask for. Okay, any questions on this section? Yes, we have a question back there.
Yeah, they're just spice on
that. About questions you should prepare beforehand in case it is necessary. What would be your suggestion as a question we should not make that maybe would sound rude or maybe of cultural difference, like something that would be okay in Brazil would not be okay in another country? Do you have any tip in that subject?
I can't think of any questions that would be off limits. I do want to say that talking about money for me is awkward, but it's totally accepted. They want you to understand your funding situation as a researcher and as a student. And it's totally okay to ask other grad students about what they feel the funding situation is like. So that is not off limits. That's totally okay to talk about. What is I don't know. I can't think of any questions that will be off limits.
Yeah, I can't either. There are some questions that they could ask you that are technically off limits. Any personal questions about, are you married? Like, do you plan on having kids? Like, do you have kids? Like, do you think you're going to have kids during your PhD? Like, those are all personal questions that they should not be asking you. You don't have to answer. If they are asking you, that's just a red flag. This link that is also at the end has a bunch of different questions broken down by categories, questions to ask your potential advisor, questions to ask your advisor's graduate students, questions to ask just general graduate students within the department, and questions to ask general faculty members within the department. So definitely recommend going through there and picking some of your favorites for interview season as well. Since interviews are super different across various departments, some departments you might go in for interviews and you might only be interviewed by 2 faculty members, or other departments you might go in and you're interviewed by every single faculty member in the department. It might be helpful to reach out to graduate students in the department that you're interviewing at a few weeks before. And this could be the graduate students that you've talked to already in the lab of the PI that you're interested in working with, and just asking them if they have any tips on the graduate student interview process, and just asking about the structure, because that might help ease some of the stressors of going in if you know exactly what to expect about the structure of the interviews and the format. And they'll probably also have tons of like specific advice to give to their program.
Okay, thank you very much for your... Oh, sorry, did I interrupt you?
I just want to say that they don't, they just want to get an understanding of who you are. And that also includes, let's see, how do I say this? The way you don't have to pretend to be anybody else. So you can dress up. When I interviewed, I think it was just business casual. But you don't, there's no rule on what you have to wear or what you have to sound like or what questions you have to ask. It really is just to get an understanding of who you are.
I think there's another question here.
Hello. I don't think you can see me, but here I am. My question is to both of you. How is it? How is the university? How is Princeton actually? And what do you do for fun in the city? I am actually interested in this university, but I do not. I know that the city is very small and it has a campus, and I want to know more about the from both of you.
Yeah, I mean, I do have to say that UCLA and Princeton are very different. UCLA is in the center of Los Angeles in Santa Monica. And so there's a lot to do there, but also there's a lot of distraction. So I actually I've enjoyed my time at Princeton because of the small town nature. I feel very calm and relaxed on the weekends. I have my dog with me, and so a lot of my extra time goes with my dog, and I just really value my free time, my time alone, just to decompress, because this is a very close-knit department and I'm a little bit more introverted. And so it's totally okay to take the weekends off. And you should talk to grad students about that. Like, do you take weekends off? Are you expected to respond to emails on the weekends? And I typically don't work on the weekends. And I think that's normal, but it just depends on the person. But I really value my time off, my weekends. Even if I don't do anything, I still take that time to relax.
Yeah, I think Princeton is perfectly localized in central Jersey, where you can easily reach anything that you're interested in. It takes an hour to get to the beach. It takes an hour to get to New York by train. Some graduate students do live in New York. Some graduate students live in Philadelphia if they're more interested in being in that big city environment. Or you could live on campus in Princeton or off campus in Princeton and get that smaller, small town vibes, things that are a little bit more quiet. Or you could commute in from New York if you want as well. I am currently in New York. I spend most of my week in New York with my partner, and there's tons of stuff to do in New York. Broadway shows, concerts, a bunch of fun things to do in the evenings and on the weekends as well. And a lot of Princeton students who live in Princeton also commute to New York to spend the day in New York on Saturday or Sunday, going to museums and concerts and going out to restaurants as well.
I would also say not to exclude a place just because, well, just it's important to consider location, but also consider the department. So I've collaborated with the University of Georgia, and I've spent some time at one of their sites in South Carolina, and it is kind of, there's nothing around. It's very like a farming community, but the department was so close, the lab was so close that all the weekends were just us being together. So even though there was nothing to do outside of the lab, there were still things to do with the lab people. Going out to the field, just enjoying the space there. So also keep that in mind.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody have other questions? No, I think you guys can go ahead.
Okay, just to recap on the timeline again. So you'll submit your graduate application around sometime in December, I think around like mid-December. And then within a few weeks or probably about a month, you'll hear back from schools about whether you've advanced to the next stage, which might be an in-person interview, or it might be a virtual interview, and then they'll fly you out. It's totally common for you to have 2 interviews over the same weekend, and don't feel like you have to choose one of the schools. You can reach out to one of them and just let them know that you have another interview during that time and ask to schedule a different time to go. Most often they'll have a makeup weekend because there will be a bunch of other students who are also in your going through the same thing where they're double booked, and they will gladly schedule you to come interview on another weekend, and that will not affect your chances of getting in. So don't worry about that. And then after you go in for the interview, you might hear as quickly as the weekend after your interview, where it might take a few more weeks to hear about whether you got accepted or not. And then you'll have until April to make your decision after you hear back from all the schools. One thing that's super important is to reach out to the professors and the graduate students that you met at a school after you've left, and just thank them for the opportunity, for bringing you to campus, for interviewing you, and just express that you're still super interested in that lab and you look forward to hearing back from them soon. Your chances of getting in a place are a lot higher if you express to the professor that that place is top of your list, because they want to accept students that are going to likely come to that program. So if you're interviewing at a school that's top of your list, make sure you communicate that to the professor that you're interviewing with, because they'll take that into consideration, and that might help your case in most instances. You might also get waitlisted at a program, which just means that you can get in potentially if there's space, if another graduate student decides not to come there as well. Do not feel pressured to respond to a program super quickly, because you do have until that deadline that's widely adopted by all the programs, I think, in the US. So don't feel pressured to accept early on in February if you're still waiting on other schools to hear back from. Yeraldi, did you want to add anything, or are there any questions from the room on receiving responses?
No, I think that pretty much summarizes that whole process of hearing back and thinking about making your decision. Yeah, don't feel pressured to make a decision right away, but if you know you're not going to go to a specific university and they accepted you, it is best to let them know so they can offer positions to the waitlisted students there. Okay. So yeah, so going into making up your decision, you can also always email current students and postdocs and even the advisor again, just to clear up any last minute questions you have. They should be as open and honest with you as possible. And I think that time, if you have any questions or any reservations, that's the time to really get to the bottom of anything. Factors to consider in this decision, again, advising, I think, is one of the most important things, because your PhD or master's program is going to be heavily dependent on that advisor and that advisor's advising style, mentorship style. Do you like hands-on professors, or is hands-off okay? And what kind of relationship do you see yourself having with that advisor? Do you find it are you okay with a very personal, I mean, not personal, but like only professional relationship, or professional, but you also get to see them on retreats, you get to go to conferences with them, things like that. For example, my PI is pretty hands off. I don't get to go into the field with him or go to conferences. And I have had hands-on professors in the past, and I thought that that would be an issue, but it's actually not. I'm pretty okay at this stage to have a hands-off professor like that, but it's really important to know that going in. Thinking about how kind of self-reliant you are and what you want out of an advisor. Also think about the research and your interest in the labs, how you fit in, and you really should not be entering a program if you don't like that research, if you don't see yourself gaining a lifelong tool experience or just growth learning from that experience. It's really important to think about the financial side of support. A lot of graduate students are self-sufficient, like they pay for everything on their own. So it's important to consider if you have dependents, any other personal things you should consider. Something I thought about was insurance. So I wanted to make sure that my doctors were going to be able to continue seeing me with this new insurance, and that was no problem. You can always talk to the graduate, the university level graduate faculty for that. Also consider resources for research. Sometimes PIs and their labs are funded by grants, or sometimes the department can pay for your like tuition and fees, or sometimes your PI can pay for your tuition and fees. If your PI is paying for the tuition and fees, that may have some trade-offs with your research funding. So just think about that. It really is variable across programs and universities. So that's something to keep in mind. Think about the structure of the program. Is there coursework? A lot of the times coursework, if there is any, it's in the first 2 years. Think about what the general exam looks like. So every PhD program has what's called a general or qualifying or comprehensive exam, which is usually around your first or second year, kind of where they just test where you're at. They want to understand your background knowledge on your research and how you're progressing as a researcher. So that's something you could talk to graduate students about, and also how long the program typically is. So PhDs in North America are around 5 years, whereas masters are around 2 years. We talked about location, which can be important. Prestige and reputation. It depends. I don't really know what to say about this. I didn't follow my PI because we moved to Princeton. I followed him because of his research. I would have been totally fine at UCLA or any other institution because of that advisor. So kind of keep that in mind, like your priorities and also what you want to get out of the institution and also from your advisor. And lastly, always consider stipend and benefits. Yes, you have a question?
Yes, I think
Okay.
Gabriela wants to make
Okay.
a question. She's online.
Yes.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Hi again. Thank you. I wanted to ask about the program duration. You said it's usually 5 years in the US. And I also know, of course, that it's expected for you to start the program and then fully dedicated for 5 years until it ends. But how are programs over there usually for when something unexpected comes? I don't know if I'm clear with the question, but
Yes.
if you have to stop for some time, can you? How is that? And yeah, thank you. That's the question.
Yeah, I can talk about that. So if something unexpected comes, you can definitely take a leave of absence or a withdrawal. It's kind of dependent on the universities. Sometimes they can hold your funding, like your tuition and fees, who's paying for that for a year or two. And sometimes you'll have to come back and meet with the graduate studies office as part of the university to talk about what your funding is going to look like when you come back. But for instance, when I left UCLA and I came to Princeton, I told them, I'm not sure if I'm going to like Princeton because I'm from LA. I've never left my family, things like that. And so they said, okay, we're going to give you a leave of absence for a year. So they kind of, in the eyes of UCLA, I kind of just took a break for a year for me to consider if I wanted to stay at Princeton. And after the year was up, I had to let them know if I was staying or leaving to Princeton. And I ended up staying at Princeton. So yeah, there's definitely opportunities for that. I also took a leave of absence during my undergrad for medical reasons. And I think it goes on a case by case basis in terms of funding. But I'm sure if something happens, they will be able to work with you.
Okay, yeah. So usually they hold up your funding for the time you're absent, and then you have to ask what's going to happen when you come back. Like that? Yeah, did I get it? Okay.
It can depend. I think the first thing would be to talk to your advisor, and then they can kind of continue that conversation with the department and the school. So it is case by case, but I do know of cases where there is leave withdrawals or leave of absences where they hold your funding for a set amount of time.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yeah. And something else that I think is really nice about some graduate programs, especially if you're doing a lot of computational work where you don't have to be in the lab every day, if you're not taking any classes, your professor could be okay with you not coming into the office every day or working from home or working from somewhere else. So for example, my professor is super chill about that and okay. So I spend a few months back home in Florida working from there with my family, and that's totally fine. Like, it's not a leave of absence. I am just working remotely. So that's something else to talk about to talk to your professor about, if they expect you to be on campus every day, or if it's okay for you to work remotely or go visit family and work from there for a given period of time. Does anyone in the room have any questions?
Sorry, they're just passing the mic.
Okay, no worries.
So I have two questions.
Okay.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm Laimara. I have two questions. One is about the health insurance situation. I talked to one of the professors who were teaching here, and he was doing his post-PhD, and he talked about how usually the insurance is, but I wanted to know how the insurance, like how much the insurance covers, especially if you have like a chronic disease or something. And it's, yeah, I wanted to know about that situation in graduate school. Hello?
I could talk about that. Yeah, so I do have chronic ailments. And so our insurance, our health insurance is covered. And also we have vision and dental insurance. So in terms of health insurance, I know that there is a deductible. So you pay up to $200 for the year, and anything else after that is covered in terms of office visits and things like that. There's also a limit to how much you pay for prescriptions. I forgot what that limit is. I think it's also maybe 150 or 200 for the year. After that, it will be covered. If for some case or for some instance, you can't even pay that deductible, if that's a hardship, you can apply for university funds to cover extra medical costs. I mean, that's specific to Princeton. I've seen it at UCLA. And so that's probably the case for most universities, where if there is a financial burden because of medical expenses, you can always or most likely apply to some sort of relief for that.
Yeah,
Arthur,
that's a
did you
very
want to?
important question.
Yeah.
To be asking at interviews, specifically to the graduate students and the postdocs who are taking advantage of the health insurance. It's going to vary a lot case by case at different universities. So at Princeton, the health insurance is automatically taken out of your tuition. So it's basically, you're not paying for it. It's essentially free. It's what you're getting, and it's full year-round coverage. So it also applies if you're at home. We have like an on-campus student health clinic, and everything we do there is completely free. So you can go in for some preventative care, some checkups, some blood work, vaccination, and that's completely free. And then everything else you do has to be in network. Insurance in the US is pretty confusing and sometimes tough to navigate. So definitely talk to graduate students at the programs that you are applying to about the cost. And I think you said you had another question as well.
Yes, I do. It's about, is there common to have people who are, doing a PhD in the United States, but their field research is in another country? And like, how does that work? Because you said you could do a lot of work from Florida, and like most of us are from Brazil. I was wondering if I could do part of my research in Brazil, if that makes sense, if that's common. That was it.
Yeah, that is super common, something you can totally do. Talk to your PI about it. So it might be a little bit harder your first 2 years because you might be taking classes in the program that you're in. So you're expected to be on campus, typically September, October, November, and then half of December, and then half of January, February, March, and April, and then the semester ends in May. So a lot of people who do field work, they do it during the summer months. So they'll leave May, June, July, August, and a lot of people in our department work in Kenya, Mozambique, other countries in Africa. So that's something completely feasible that you can do. It just might be harder if your field season is, let's say, in February and you have to teach during that time. That might be something that might be harder to do some semesters when you're teaching and taking classes.
I have another
And
question
if I were,
now.
go ahead.
No, you can finish answering.
I was just going to say that if I was a PI and I had a student from Brazil, let's say, and they wanted to do field work in Brazil, I find that to be a really good opportunity just to learn about research at a different place, and also that student's going to know a lot more about that place. And so I just think that that is totally possible and encouraged.
Okay, the next question is about I get the impression that you guys in the PhD usually work at teaching too, like as, I don't know if teaching assistant, but like you do give a lot of classes. How does that work? Does it complement your oh, I forgot. Like your salary, and which months does that usually happen? Is it during the same period that you're getting your classes also?
Yeah, great question. Also going to vary a lot from school to school. Here at Princeton, you take classes your first 2 years. That's 4 semesters that you'll be taking classes. It's a light course load. So it's not like you're spending time doing lots and lots of homework. You might have a few papers to read every week. Like that's usually it. And then in Princeton, you do get some of your funding from teaching. So you're required to teach 4 semesters. And there's a rule at Princeton where you have to teach your first semester here, and everyone is teaching the same introductory biology class. So that can range from either leading a 3-hour lab every week or leading 2 50-minute precepts every week, which are essentially discussion classes. So it's not teaching in the traditional sense where you're preparing all of the course materials and teaching an entire class. Like, you do have a professor attached to the class and you're leading a small portion of a discussion class or a lab class, and you're helping with the grading. So there will be some semesters where you're teaching and taking classes. There might be some semesters where you're just teaching or just taking classes. It does vary, and you do have a say over some of the classes that you're going to get to teach and what semesters you do want to teach as well.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
I don't think so.
Okay. So the next page, I'm not going to really go over this, but it's just a bunch of vocabulary terms on the difference between fellowships and grant money and the different ways that you can be funded during your PhD, but it's going to be super specific to the program that you are applying to. And as we mentioned, don't forget to accept your offers, decline your offers as soon as you know that you're not going to that school, and reach out to the professors and thank them again for being into consideration and for their time. It is a small field. Programs are small, so you don't want to get on anyone's bad side. And you might end up being collaborators with them in the future. So you still want to be cordial to everybody. And if you're on the wait list, you might be waiting to hear back. So you could also reach out to that department, that PI, to ask updates about the waitlist and to just also tell them that you're still interested in being considered. And yeah, so other options, I think, as well, is to remember that there are many paths to graduate school. Don't go to graduate school just because you got into just one place. If you're not excited to go to that place, you're not excited to go to the research, you can take a year off doing something else, getting more research experience, because it is 5 to 6 years of your life and you don't want to be miserable in a place doing something that you don't want to do. Yeraldi, do you have anything that you want to say before we open the floor for last questions?
I think that about wraps it up. Thank you, Arthur. Does anybody have any questions? Again, there are many links that are super helpful. I wish I had during my application season at the end of this worksheet.
Yeah, I think they don't have any other questions, Arthur and Yeraldi. Your workshop on graduate school application covered pretty much everything. I guess they got valuable tips from your workshop and to go through the whole application process. So thank you so much for setting out this time to be with us virtually. And yeah, let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you. And yeah, feel free to reach out to either of us if you have any additional questions, and we'd be happy to help answer them or direct you to someone who can answer them.
Thank you so much. I will give them the.
Okay. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.